Hey, stop using God's banner as a charge for your sin, as we Godot for it! Anyway, I'm going to start doing a tutorial series on the Godot game engine. I don't know if it's pronounced Godot or Godot or whatever, but Godot seems to work very good for my intro, so I'm going to stick with that. If, however, you want an already established tutorial series, GameFromScratch.com has a tutorial series on the Godot game engine, not only on their webpage using videos and text files, but also on YouTube, because, you know, that's where they put the video files. I'm not going to explain that. And it covers a lot of basics about Godot, which I'm probably just going to gloss over. But he focuses on 2D, whereas I'm going to do 3D. Ta-da! One extra dimension for free! So, you can go to Game From Scratch and look at those tutorials. But I'm going to go over a few things about Godot and the differences between it and Blender. When you first open it up, you have this. Now, I already have some projects. You can always use new project, import project. I'm going to scan for projects. And I'm going to use this projects folder, open, and boom! There's all my projects. I seem to be missing some. There's also the Godot demos, which are really good. You can download them and go through them. It does have a lot of stuff. I'm going to go ahead and open up Sky. You can double click on it or click on it and choose Edit. We've got all this up here. Now, it has been said before that the Godot game engine looks a little bit like Unity. Personally, I've used Unity. I like Unity. It's an okay game engine. But it's huge and fat. Basically because they give you all of these resources. Now, if you grab the Godot engine, and actually if you grab everything on their website, the Godot game engine, the Godot demos, and Better Collada, the export examples, or the export templates, all together, it's not as big as Unity. Unity's, last time I checked, was like 1.2 gigabytes. All this stuff from Godot is, I think, about 100 megs. And when you download it, it's not an installer, it's just a project manager. It does have help, built-in help, which is a little hit or miss, but it is good for getting started. Basically, I'm not going to say I taught myself the Godot game engine, but I downloaded it, brought it home to an offline environment, and played around with it, and did get a little bit far. Now, I'm not sure if I'm going to stop my Let's Blending tutorial series, but I am going to go over a few differences between Godot and Blender. Now, with Blender, you have all these logic bricks. And people who use tutorials, I hope you're listening, because in the scripts, I think it does have zoom. I'm going to check that out in a bit. But in Blender, you have all of these logic bricks. In Godot, you don't. Which, let's see, I have the old Collada. In Godot, you do have to write everything yourself, and scripting's, well, it's close to Python, so if you've used Blender's Python, Godot's GD script's fairly easy to learn. It's kind of like a cross between C and Python. Now, if I were to explain the Godot game engine to someone in a single sentence, I'd say it's like Unity Lite with a side of awesome and hold the crap. It is actually pretty good, and it is all self-contained, so you can run it from a USB drive or wherever. That way, if you're on the go and you're like, oh man, I really want to work on the game, there's a library. You can. Now, let's see, computer, local disk C, EEFD, program files, no, not x86, Blender Foundation, Blender. If you haven't noticed, I've been using Blender for a long time. 2.74 Python. No. Scripts. Add-ons. Better Collada. Control C. Click on this and Control V. Yes. I'm also using TerraCopy because it's a good copying program. Okay, it's there. Just copy it over. This will give you your better Collada. Close Blender. Open Blender. Blender. Now, I don't have it here, so I'll go to my user preferences, check add-ons, and the little search button, COLL. Import, export, better Collada exporter, click yes, save user settings, file, export, Collada default, and better Collada, which is actually pretty good. Something to note about exporting as Collada, I think you can also export as object. Let's see. I have my old Sky project. They did change a few things between 1.0 and 1.1, and they no longer automatically translate hex and decimal color, so I'm going to have to write a tri-hex translator. Whoop-de-doo. Okay, Collada items. Okay, yes, so you can export objects. Now, some things to note. Exporting objects will combine all the items visible in your scene into one gigantic blob of a model. It's good if you have a single model in a single blend file and you export it to object. Personally, I'd export the entire scene as a Collada, because sometimes you have a resource pack, and then I'll go in and grab each mesh and save it as an external mesh. Do that with a whole bunch of stuff. Now, the thing about exporting as Collada. When you import into Godot, everything has to be at. I wonder if I can zoom into this. If not, you have to use, I think it's control. No, control A. Yeah, use control A to apply the location and rotation and scale. Well, actually, the rotation and scale, you don't really want to apply the location because that screws everything up. But you do want the object locations of all objects in the exported collada to have a location of 0, 0, 0. Otherwise, especially if you've got a character setup, because when you import them into Godot, and they're not at 0, 0, 0, they'll be offset quite a bit, and that causes problems. Now, and here, blends, blocks, boots. Okay. What did I do to you? Poor thing. Okay. So here, if I hit the tilde to show you all the layers, everything's centered. Okay. Now, when you're importing stuff, some more things to know about Godot. In Blender, you can add objects fairly easily, usually just by, in the script, either getting the current scene, then adding the object to the current scene, passing it the object that you're adding, plus the object that's adding the object you're adding, or you can use logic bricks. In Godot, you have to export things as scenes, or, yeah, as scenes, which are a collection of nodes. And if you haven't noticed, I'm using a different screen recorder, Ice Cream screen recorder. It seems to be doing pretty well. I hope it continues to do well, but with Godot, you have to export your scene, and then you have to re-import it and attach it to the node tree. It is a bit complicated, but Godot is better in some areas than Blender and worse in some areas, so it might be difficult to add a lot of objects. But I think it's more difficult to remove objects. Also, the last time I used Godot was 1.0, so I don't know if they've changed a whole lot. Collision detection. To do two-way collision detection to like a 4-node setup. I hope they fixed that. And you do have a whole bunch of nodes here. Basically, okay, 18. What you do is you create a node, then you can rename it. Basically, for a 3D scene, you need a spatial node. For a 2D scene, you need a similar node. Also, you can have 2D in 3D and 3D in 2D. There is a bit of a workaround to do that. I think with 3D, you attach a mesh object to a sprite, but since I'm basically working around in, although I might do that, working around in 3D mostly, I'm just going to have 2D and 3D, which is great for menus. Like in Blender, you have to build your own menus, but you don't have to use as much math as you do in Unity. Now for character and object movement, you do have to use some math, especially with 3D character and object movement. I don't like math. I'm good at it, but I don't like it. So basically, you have your scene, your tree of nodes that create your scene, and to import another scene into your scene to attach like an axe to your player's hand. Not only do you have to preload it, then you have to rename it, because you don't want to wind up with two trees that have the, well, you don't want to have two similar branches on the same tree. Like, let's say I have a spatial here, I create another spatial node, spatial, and I go up here, and I create another spatial node, it's spatial 2. Because I could continue going spatial, constantly indenting, but as soon as I add another spatial here, and there's two spatials, it renames one. And if you have a lot of objects to add, that can be a pain. You can try to use lists, and remember to pop them out of the list when they're removed from the scene. Oh, here we go. Or you can use a number and constantly increase it. Only problem with using a number and constantly increasing it is that someone might sit there long enough to run through all the numbers that they can. I think it's about 32 million. I don't know how big an integer can be in Godot, but they could run through all the different numbers you have to rename the objects that you're importing into your scene. So that's something to think about. So as far as object addition, Blender does beat out Godot, but I've written shaders in Godot a lot easier than I have in Blender, which is a good thing. I do have a shader, and I might show it to you. Another thing to note is the Godot scripts, the GD scripts, are text files. So if you have like an old project and you want to use the scripts or a few lines from the scripts, but you don't want to pull the whole script in or anything like that, you can usually just open them up in some text editor, rename them to an RTF format, and bring them in there. Now, for, let's see, what was it? There are tile maps, and there are 3D tile maps. I can't remember what they're called, but you can pretty much build a level like you would in Minecraft with a bunch of blocks, or you can pull in a complete map of one solid object. Yeah, here we go, grid map, that's what it is. So you can either use the grid map to produce a map made out of a collection of smaller blocks, or you can make one big map and pull it in. Last time I checked, grid maps, collisions, you had to be really careful. And also, depending on the size of the grid map's objects, it would either take a lot more resources than it would to just say, okay, I'm just going to create this map out of one solid object. But if you create a map out of one solid object, you have to be careful of the amount of vertices you have. You might not have as much detail as you would be able to if you use a grid map. I'm thinking about using a grid map, just because it might make things easier. I don't know how to access the individual pieces of a grid map, but you can just create a grid map and then add a bunch of objects. It doesn't matter. But I'm hoping that gives you a nice intro to the Godot engine and a few of the differences between Blender and Godot. There are a lot more. But the scripting, since it's similar to Python, is fairly easy. And it's actually fairly easy to learn. All you have to do is figure out how to add the spatial objects to start up your scene, and then a few things about scripting, and the help will help you a lot, but it is sometimes a bit hit or miss. So I'm going to end this so that I can start a completely different Godot tutorial where we'll actually do